welcome to Brewing Up Safety. This is an occupational health and safety presentation, and I understand it's the end of the day, and it's probably not very exciting. So to make it a little bit of a game, there's not very many of you left, but I appreciate you all being here. We'll turn it into a little bit of a drinking game. So every time I say the word safety, take a drink. Anytime I say the word safe, take a drink. And anytime your neighbor rolls their eyes at something I say, take a drink. Okay. So again, this is called Brewing Up Safety. It's an occupational health and safety presentation on what you guys can do as brewers and breweries to comply with the health and safety legislation. But before we dive into all of the information today, I just want to take the opportunity to introduce myself, give you a little bit of my background and how I ended up here presenting in front of all of you guys today. So my name is Alanna McBride, and I am an occupational health and safety and environmental manager, and I've been working in the industry for about 9 years now. I currently manage the North American Health and Safety Program for a global analytical testing company, and we test mining samples for precious metals. So we receive huge rock samples, we crush them, we pulverize them, we digest them with different acids, we run them through analytical instruments, and then we get the results that we share with our clients. So because I've been with this global company for about 9 years, it's given me vast experience in a variety of industries. So I'm very familiar with laboratory industries, industrial industries, and the manufacturing industry. And it's also given me the opportunity to become very familiar with the WorkSafe BC regulations, the BC Occupational Health and Safety regulations, the BC Worker Compensation Act, the guidelines, publications, what WorkSafe BC officers tend to look for when they come to breweries, and the types of inspections that they do, and so on. I've also been very passionate about craft beer. I think I get it from my mom, who would murder me if she knew that I was using this photo of her tonight, so don't tell her. So I've always had a passion for craft beer, and about 1.5 years ago, I thought it would be fun to get a second part-time job. So I was hired at a local craft brewery where my passion for craft beer blossomed. And it was while working there that I discovered the need for education and awareness about occupational health and safety within a brewery. I saw a lot of different things that worried me, it freaked me out a bit, and ultimately through that experience and through building relationships with various people in different breweries, I've ended up here presenting in front of you guys today. So as you guys know, in a brewery there are tons of health and safety hazards, and I just said safety, so everybody take a drink. I'm looking at you all. Thank you, in the front row. There's far too many hazards to go over today. We don't have enough time to dig into the nitty-gritty of every little thing. So what I've done is I've selected the top safety hazard that I've identified based on my experience and based on conversations with different brewers. So the main hazard that I'm going to go over today is on confined space. The whole meat of this presentation is on what you guys need to do to ensure staff are kept safe while working around or entering confined space. I'm also going to touch on CO2 and manual handling of kegs. That will be very brief at the end, but I will touch on some of the key points of that as well. I will give you guys some references for where you can get some more information, and that includes the applicable legislation and any sort of publications from WorkSafe BC. And the main focus of this is for you guys to understand what you can do to reduce your liability and ensure compliance with the BC Occupational Health and Safety regulations. Okay, so now we're on to the topic of confined space, and a lot of people have heard this term before, but you might not understand exactly what confined space is. So WorkSafe BC has defined confined space as an area other than an underground working that A, is enclosed or partially enclosed, B, is not designed or intended for continuous human occupancy, C, has limited or restricted means for entry or exit that may complicate the provision for first aid, evacuation, rescue, or other emergency response service. And D, is large enough and so configured that a worker could enter to perform assigned work. So that's the formal legal definition of what confined space. I understand it might be a bit confusing and you're wondering, well, what does that mean for me and my brewery or my distillery? And this is a photo that I found online of exactly how not to enter confined space. So please make sure that none of your brewers are entering confined space this way. So what does confined space look like in your breweries or your distilleries? So what I'm going to go through is not a very exhaustive list. It's just a few examples. You might have some other confined space that's not included in this list, so please take this with a grain of salt. So confined space in your breweries or your distilleries may include tanks, obviously. I think that's the main one everyone usually jumps to. Fermenters, grain bins, silos, mash tuns, kettles, yeast propagation tanks. If you're a larger facility, you might have sump tanks and even water treatment tanks. And then there's other examples as well, but again, those tend to be the top examples of confined space within a brewery or a distillery. Okay. So now you understand what confined space is, you know what the legal definition is, you understand what it may look like in your brewery, and what are the hazards of confined space? Why do we need to be worried about this? Why do we need to ensure that we're keeping staff safe? So the main hazard of confined space is obviously oxygen deficiency. If somebody were to enter a confined space where there is a lack of oxygen, it would be an asphyxiant and the person would become incapacitated very quickly. Another big hazard in confined space is exposure in the presence of gases such as CO2 or nitrogen. Again, those are not the only gases that may be present. It depends on the process you're using, the type of brewery or distillery that you have. But gases such as nitrogen and CO2 are major hazards as well. Another hazard of a confined space are falls. So a lot of the confined spaces that you have are awkward to get into. They might be quite large tanks, and if you don't have the proper equipment in place or the proper procedures in place, it will also make the rescue very difficult. So even if you have proper procedures in place, if somebody were to become incapacitated within your confined space, even with proper procedures and the proper fall protection equipment, the rescue is still going to be quite difficult as well. So those are the main hazards of confined space. So now you're saying, okay, I understand what the hazards are, what do I do about it, and what can I implement at my brewery or my distillery to keep staff safe? So what I have up on the screen here is what we call the hierarchy of controls. And anytime you're trying to consider controls for hazards, if you have an incident and you need to implement corrective actions, you always want to reference the hierarchy of controls. And you want to start from the top and you want to work your way down. And what this will do is this will ensure that you've implemented the best controls that you possibly can to keep your staff safe. So at the very top of the hierarchy, we've got elimination. So if you can completely eliminate the hazard from your site, that is the best option that you could possibly think of. If that's not possible, your next best option is to substitute it. So you want to substitute the hazard for something that is less hazardous. If that's not practical, the next best option is to engineer a control. And by engineering a control, you are physically separating the worker from the hazard. If after you try and implement an engineering control and it either is not practical or perhaps it doesn't fully control the hazard, your next best bet is to look at administrative controls. And administrative controls are things like safe work procedures, training, signage, and basically controlling and changing the way that staff actually do their work. And then the very final option for control, based on the hierarchy of controls, is PPE, or personal protective equipment. So a lot of people who are not familiar with health and safety and controlling hazards, most people tend to dive directly to PPE as the best option for controlling a hazard, and you want to make sure that you stay away from that. PPE should always be the very last option after you've looked into the options on the hierarchy of controls. So to tie that all into confined space, the best option for controlling hazards for confined space is to ideally not have to enter confined space at all. I understand that's not practical at a lot of locations, it might not be reasonable, and that's fine, but that is something that you want to consider. What can we do to completely eliminate the need to enter a confined space? You can also look at using cleaning in place systems as much as possible, and by doing so, you will reduce or eliminate the internal manual cleaning of confined space. So if you can't eliminate it altogether, if you're able to reduce the need and the frequency for people to enter it, you're going to be better off. You can also utilize tools such as inspection mirrors, video cameras, and flashlights for part of your maintenance and inspections of any of the confined space that you may have at your breweries. You can utilize long-handed tools, scrubbers for cleaning, which again will reduce and potentially eliminate the need to go in for cleaning at all. Some administrative controls could include posting warning signs. So anybody that has a confined space should already be aware of the need to have signs posted, and it should say, "Caution, confined space, no one is to enter." You also want to have a written program, and the need for that is only if people actually need to enter your confined space, and I will go into more detail in that in a few slides. You'll also want to utilize permits. So in the event you do have staff that need to enter confined space, you need to make sure, in order to be legally compliant with the regulations, that you're utilizing work entry permits for confined space. Another really important component of any confined space entry program is training and education of staff. So you need to make sure that you've taken the time to educate every single employee who may be near or in confined space. Everybody needs to understand what the hazards are, what the controls are, and what they need to do to work in that confined space safely. And also, as part of your due diligence, you want to ensure that you've got training sign-offs so that you can prove, if something were to happen, that you did in fact train these staff. And then the final and most important part of any confined space control is making sure that the work is properly supervised. So everybody should have designated supervisors or lead hands or key staff who are overseeing the work that's being done within the brewery. That might be a head brewer, it could be a manager, it could be an owner. I don't know what it looks like at your breweries, but you want to make sure that you have somebody who is qualified and who is overlooking and supervising that work. Okay, so now we know what confined space is. We've gone over the definition. You understand what it might look like at your brewery or your distillery. You understand what the hazards are, and you should have a good understanding now of what the controls might look like for you. And now you're probably wondering what the next step is. So directly from the regulations, it states that the employer must ensure that all confined space hazards are eliminated or minimized, and that work is performed in a safe manner. And I just said safe, so everybody take a drink. Thank you. So the very first step that everybody needs to do to be compliant with confined space is to identify all of the confined space. That is step number one. Everybody needs to go back to their brewery or their distillery, grab a pint, grab your guys, walk around on a break or after your shift, and identify every single confined space in your brewery or your distillery. If you're not sure if something is confined space, write it down and reach out to somebody who's got the expertise, get their input, and make sure that you're being duly diligent in identification of confined space. Once you've done this and you've identified all of the confined space or potential confined space, the next thing that you need to do is you need to determine whether or not anybody is going to need to enter that confined space at any point in time. Even if it's once a year for maintenance or once a month for cleaning, whatever it may be, you need to identify, yes, people will enter this space, or no, there's no chance anybody will ever have to enter it. So if there are people in the room right now who are freaking out and thinking, oh shoot, we've got confined space, we have people who are entering it, I don't think we're compliant, I don't think we're doing what we need to do, I'm going to try my best to break down for you as detailed as I can in the amount of time that we have, exactly what you need to do to be compliant. So if you do have people who will be entering a confined space, you need to have a formalized and written confined space entry program. And when I mean written, I mean you literally need to sit at a computer, you need to type it up, it needs to be tangible, it needs to be something that you can present to staff, to WorkSafe BC if they were to come on site and do an audit or an inspection. It should be kept electronically, it can be kept in your safety program binder or manual, whatever you may have, but it needs to be something that is documented and formally written. And the program also needs to be developed and written by a qualified person. So WorkSafe BC defines a qualified person as somebody who is knowledgeable of the work, the hazards involved, and the means to control the hazards by reason of education, training, experience, or a combination thereof. So if you guys yourself feel like you're qualified, that's fantastic. If you feel like some of your brewers may be considered qualified, that's awesome. And if you're panicking and freaking out and thinking, I don't think we have anybody qualified to do this, then your best option is to reach out to a third party and get their expertise. You can reach out to WorkSafe BC, and I'm sure they would be pleased to come in and help you make sure that you guys are doing exactly what you need to do. So when you are developing your confined space entry program, there are legislated requirements for what needs to be included in that program. So you need to have assignment of responsibility. So who is going to be responsible for what? So you want to consider your key roles in a program. So that would include your brewers, it might include supervisors and owners, it might include first aid attendants, it might include lounge staff, whoever you possibly think might need to be involved in any confined space entry. You want to make sure that you've got clearly defined responsibilities for them included in the program. You also need to have a list of all of your confined spaces. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the very first step that you guys need to do. Grab a pint, grab your guys, walk around, and identify all of the confined space within your brewery or your distillery. And what I would suggest doing is utilizing an Excel spreadsheet. You can make a table in a Word document, and you can have a column that lists what the confined space is, where it's located, whether or not staff need to enter it, and whether or not a permitting system is required. That's the bare minimum that needs to be included. After you've identified all of your confined space, the next step is to conduct a hazard assessment on all of the confined space. And again, the hazard assessment needs to be formalized and documented, and the records of those assessments you want to retain as part of your program. And how to complete a hazard assessment would be a completely separate seminar. We don't have time for that today, but there is a lot of great information on the WorkSafe BC website, and there is that guidance document from WorkSafe BC that was recently released on safety for breweries and distilleries. So there is some great information in there that you guys can reference. Just a side note on the hazard assessment. So if your only confined space are tanks and they're all identical tanks, you don't need to do an assessment on each individual tank. But if you've got different types of confined spaces, you'll want to make sure that you do individual assessments on each individual type of confined space. So after you've completed your assessments and you've got that documented, you've identified the risk, you've given it a risk rating, you've implemented controls, the next step is to then take that information from that hazard assessment and develop your written safe work procedures for entry into and work into confined space. As part of your program for confined space entry, you'll also want to make sure that you have developed and are utilizing confined space entry permits. And I will go into the work procedures, and I will give you an example of what a permit looks like in a little bit. Okay, so as part of your confined space entry program, I talked about the confined space safe work procedures. And a lot of people hear safe work procedures and they freak out. They don't necessarily understand exactly what it looks like and what needs to be included. The good thing is that the BC Occupational Health and Safety regulations are quite prescriptive with this, and they give you a list of exactly what needs to be included in your procedures. So it's a great starting point for you guys. So as part of your safe work procedures for entry into any confined space, you want to make sure that you have in there that Word document with the table of all of the confined spaces, your Excel document, whatever it may be, where you've listed what all of your confined spaces are. You also want to list in your safe work procedures whether or not entry permits are required. So if you've got people who are going to be entering that confined space, permits are required 100%. If you've got confined space where nobody's going to be entering it, then of course no entry permits will be required. You also want to consider lockout and isolation. This is extremely important for the safety, everybody take a drink, of the confined space. So for example, if you've got some gas lines running into some tanks, you want to make sure that they are shut off and locked out before anybody is even allowed to consider entering a confined space. You need to have provisions for verification and testing of the atmosphere within the confined space. This is imperative to the health and safety of staff before they enter the confined space. You want to consider cleaning, purging, venting, or inerting of the atmosphere within the confined space as well. And you'll want to make sure that your written safe work procedures have provisions for this included in them. Ventilation is also a key to the safe entry into confined space. So you want to make sure that you've included in there what needs to be done, what the ventilation needs to look like, who's responsible for that ventilation, and so on. Another really important part to safe entry into confined space is having a standby person. So you can imagine having people enter a confined space and not having any sort of standby person. If people within that confined space were to become incapacitated or overcome by certain gases or fumes, how would anybody know, and how would anybody take the necessary measures to retrieve them from that confined space? So having a standby person is key, and it's also a legal requirement for anybody who needs to enter that confined space. You also need to have provisions for rescue. So if somebody were to become incapacitated within that confined space, what are the necessary steps to take to retrieve them safely and to make sure that they're given the most prompt treatment that they may require? Okay, so another part of confined space entry that I know can be a bit confusing for people who are not familiar with it is the testing of the atmosphere. What does that look like? What do you need to do? What types of tools and monitors do you need to have? What types of records do you need to keep, and so on? So I'll try and break it down in as much detail as I can. The regulations do provide a lot of very specific details depending on specific types of confined spaces, but this hopefully will give you a little bit of a starting point. So pre-entry testing is something that needs to be done before anybody enters a confined space at any time. And technically speaking, that means even if somebody needs to stick their head in a confined space, all of these requirements apply. And of course, if somebody needs to completely submerge themselves within a confined space, you need to make sure that you're following these steps as well. And pre-entry testing should be done using an appropriate gas monitor, and it should be done at least 20 minutes before somebody enters that confined space. It should also be completed before any ventilation so that you have a really good idea as to what the hazards are within that confined space. You want to make sure that the results of that testing are recorded and posted at the entry points of that confined space. So what a lot of companies do, and I strongly encourage you guys to do the same thing, is to have as part of your confined space entry permit, you can have a section where you can record the findings of your testing, because you do have a requirement to post that permit at the entry point as well. So if you have everything in one document, it's easy, you just post it there, and you don't have to worry about having multiple different things posted at all of the entry points. Continuous monitoring is strongly recommended whenever it's practicable, and what this does is it ensures that anybody who is inside that confined space, they're wearing a meter or a monitor that is consistently taking readings to ensure the health and safety of them as they're inside that confined space. Because the atmosphere can change very quickly in a very short period of time, and all it takes is one burst of a dangerous gas before somebody is seriously injured or they become incapacitated. You also want to make sure that any sort of testing that's being completed within that confined space is being done by a qualified person. And so the same definition as we went over before applies to this as well. So again, if you feel like you don't have somebody who's qualified, please make sure that you reach out to somebody who has expertise in this field. You can reach out to WorkSafe BC, maybe reach out to a few other breweries and see what they're doing, and then you can go from there. And with any sort of monitoring equipment, it doesn't just apply to a gas monitor or a gas meter, but you do have the legal requirement to ensure that it's properly maintained and calibrated as per the manufacturer's specifications. So a lot of this type of equipment, the manufacturers will specify the requirement for an annual factory calibration. And what that means is that you actually have to send it off site. It usually takes a few weeks. You can send it to the manufacturer, you can send it to an approved vendor, whatever the manufacturer says, and they will factory calibrate it for you. And then what they'll do is they'll stamp it, they'll put a sticker on it, they'll send it back to you. You'll receive a calibration certificate, which is very important for your due diligence and as part of your program, and you want to make sure that that is retained with all of your other confined space entry program requirements. You also want to make sure that you keep your testing record. So as I mentioned earlier, I strongly encourage you to have a testing portion as part of your confined space entry permit, so it's all within one document. It makes it a lot easier, it makes it much more concise, it's less records to keep track of, so that is something that you guys can do. And you want to make sure that when you do have your testing records, that you've included the date and time that the testing has taken place, the tester's initials, so whoever that may be, and making sure that they're qualified, any sort of concentrations of the gases that you're testing for within your confined space, and then the continuous measurements that are taken as well. So now we're going to look at what a confined space entry permit may actually look like. Again, I know people hear a permit, it's a bit confusing. What does that need to look like? What level of detail do we need to include? So I'll try and explain that in a little bit more detail in the coming slide. So your entry permit needs to include the description of the confined space. So you'll have a list of all of your confined spaces within your breweries, within your distilleries. Maybe you have a tank and you've named it Tank 1. If somebody is going to be entering it, you'll need to make sure that you describe on that permit Tank 1, where it's located, and the type of work activities that will be completed within that tank. So that might be cleaning, it might be maintenance, it might be an inspection. That needs to be included on your permit. You'll also need to have, as part of your entry permit, a section where you can list the names of the people who will be entering that permit. For your guys' purposes, I can't imagine there would ever be more than one person entering a confined space at one time. However, if there were that case, you would want to make sure that you're listing all of the names of people that would need to enter that space. You also will need to have, as part of your permit, the required precautions to take. So what are the safe work procedures, and what do staff need to do to enter that space safely? Permits will also expire, so you want to have a date and the time that the permit will expire. So for example, if you have somebody entering a confined space on a Monday and they're going to be in there from 8 to 12 p.m., that's one permit. If you have somebody entering a confined space the following day from 8 to 12 p.m., you need to make sure that you've got an entirely separate permit. They're not recyclable, and it's not something that you should be reusing. You can reuse the template, but you want to make sure that you're updating the information so that it's specific for each of the confined space entries that will be taking place. And I do have an example permit here from WorkSafe BC, so just give me a second here. Okay, so this is an excellent resource for all of you guys in the room from WorkSafe BC, and it's a confined space entry program, a reference manual. And this will describe in a lot of detail exactly what your confined space entry program will need to look like. All you need to do to access this is you can simply Google WorkSafe BC confined space, and a lot of these links will come up for you guys. And I will just scroll down to the bottom here. Just give me one moment. Excuse all of this other stuff. Okay, so I'm sorry it's so small, you guys, but this will give you an idea as to what a confined space entry permit may look like. This is quite a detailed example from WorkSafe BC. This one is 4 pages long, and yours won't necessarily need to be this complex, but it will give you an idea as to what an entry permit should look like, generally speaking. So at the top here, you'll want to include the name of the space. So again, if you've got a tank and you've named it Tank 1, Tank 2, whatever the heck you decide to name it, that's where you want to include that information. You'll also want to have the date of entry. So again, these permits are not recyclable. They need to be completed for each individual entry of any confined space that you may have. So you'll want to have the date and the time that the entry begins, and the date and the time with which the permit will expire. WorkSafe BC also has definitions on the level of hazard of the atmosphere within the confined space. So you can assign a low, moderate, or high rating. I don't have time to go into detail about what that looks like, but again, if you guys reference through this manual, it'll tell you exactly what that means for you. You'll also want to include the description of the space and the work that will be completed within that space. So again, is it going to be maintenance? Are you going in to clean? Is it just to do some inspections? That's what you want to make sure that you include on your permit. You'll also want to have a section on ventilation. So what ventilation will you be utilizing? What is it going to look like? And what's required to ensure that the ventilation is appropriate? You can see here, this is the example that I was talking about. So a lot of employers will add the gas testing of the atmosphere prior to entry as part of their permit, and I strongly encourage you guys to do the same. It's nice to have it all within one document. On page 3, you're going to have a little section about the standby person. So who's responsible for it, making sure that they sign off on it and that they date it so that they're held accountable for the safety of the person that they're overlooking. If you'll be having more than one person entering a confined space, which I mentioned earlier, I don't think would be the case for anybody in the room, but if you do, you can list all of the names and then have a sort of check-in, check-out system to ensure that anybody who has entered that confined space safely exit. So what you can do is you can put one line every time they enter the space and then another line to make an X anytime that they safely exit that space. Here they also list a lot of considerations for the safe entry in confined space. So this alone might be an excellent reference for you guys to making sure that you've got your proper safe work procedures. And then the final part of your permit should include control measures. So what exactly do people need to do to enter any sort of confined space safely? And you want to list those here. And this is information that you can take directly from your written safe work procedures. You should also have provisions for an emergency, so what to do if somebody is to become incapacitated, what if somebody falls and we can't rescue them. And that's basically it for the example of the permit. So again, it's called a reference manual confined space entry program, and you can access that through WorkSafe BC's website. Okay. Another thing that you guys should note is anytime you do utilize a permit, you need to make sure that you're retaining that permit for at least 1 year. I strongly encourage you to retain any sort of health and safety documents for at least 5 years. It just shows a pattern of behavior, it's good for your due diligence, and it's just a great record to have in the event something serious were to happen, which, knock on wood, hopefully nothing serious happens. Okay, so there is tons of information about confined space. I understand that the occupational health and safety regulations for BC are quite complex. There's the BC's Worker Compensation Act, there's all these guidelines, there's publications, there's standards. Where exactly do you need to look to find information on confined space? So Part 9 of the BC Occupational Health and Safety Regulations is where you can find specific information on confined space. And again, Google will be your best friend. All you need to do is open it up and simply type in Confined Space WorkSafe BC or Part 9 BC Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, and it'll bring up all of the links that you could possibly need. WorkSafe BC has also developed guidelines, so a lot of their health and safety regulations are very performance-based. They're not prescriptive. So they'll tell you what you need to do to be compliant, but they won't tell you exactly how to achieve compliance. And with confined space, for all of the different varieties of confined spaces out there, it can be very confusing. So WorkSafe BC has developed guidelines for confined space to help you better understand and interpret exactly what you need to do to be compliant. So the guidelines are also Part 9, and it focuses on confined space. WorkSafe BC has also developed a number of excellent publications, which will be extremely useful for everybody in this room. So the very first one is the most recent one that was released, and it is specific for craft breweries and distilleries in BC, and it's just called Health and Safety for Craft Breweries and Distilleries. If you haven't had the opportunity to look at it yet, please make sure that you take some time and read through it. It's an excellent snapshot of everything that you need to do to have a proper safety program for your business. They also have a publication which is called The Hazards of Confined Space for Food and Beverage Industries, which would be applicable to everybody in the room today. There's a publication on the management of confined spaces in agriculture, a handbook for workers. And then the one that I just showed you guys with the example entry permit is called Confined Space Entry Program, a reference manual. And again, that is going to be the most valuable publication for you guys to help you truly understand what the requirements are and what you need to do to ensure you've got a proper program in place. Okay, so that's basically all I have to go over for confined space, but to summarize it all, because it is a lot of information, I'll try and break it down step by step for exactly what you need to do to ensure compliance and to ensure the health and safety of your staff. So the very first step that everybody needs to do is you need to go back to your brewery or your distillery, and you need to walk around and you need to identify all of your confined space. Once you've identified all of your confined spaces, the next step is to determine whether or not staff will have to enter that confined space. If staff will never enter that confined space at any point in time, all you need to do is you need to secure the entry points of that confined space, and you need to make sure that you've got the appropriate signage. If staff will enter that confined space, that's where things get a little bit more complicated and there are quite a few more requirements, and you'll need to make sure that you have a confined space entry program. And as part of that program, you will have a list of all of the confined spaces. You will make sure that you've completed the hazard assessments for each of the confined spaces. You'll have written safe work procedures developed and implemented. You'll have a permitting system, so the confined space entry permit. You'll make sure that you've trained staff on the program. Again, training of staff is key. Even if you don't have staff entering confined space, it's extremely important that they're aware of the hazards and that they're not to enter any confined space. And you'll need to make sure that there's supervision for confined space entry work. And then with any sort of safety program, whether it's a safe work procedure, your entire program, a policy or a procedure, there is a requirement to review it at least annually. And that's something that you can do with your safety committee, you can do it with your safety rep, you can get everybody together once a year and go through and with a fine-tooth comb and just make sure that the information that you've included is still accurate, making sure that it's still reasonable, making sure that the controls are the same. And then I strongly encourage you to do refresher training for your staff as well. Okay. And if you guys do that, you'll probably be as happy as this guy, but hopefully with a few more teeth. Okay, so that's it for confined space. The only other things that I wanted to go over with you guys today are a couple of other hazards. So the next one is CO2. Nothing new to anybody in this room, I don't believe. So there's just a couple of refreshers for you guys, probably information that you already know, but there are some important components that you need to make sure that you do have in place at your breweries. So as we all know, the fermentation process produces CO2 gas. Again, no surprise, we can't eliminate it, it's just a part of the business, it's nature of the work. The hazards of exposure to high concentrations of CO2 include headache, dizziness, confusion, or loss of consciousness. Exposure to high concentrations of CO2 can take place from cylinders or leaking cylinders, pipes, or tanks, or while you're purging tanks. If you guys take away anything from this presentation today on CO2, if you don't already have CO2 monitors or alarms in place, that should be something that you guys go home and you do right away. CO2 alarms are not very expensive, and if you don't have them in place, how are you possibly going to know whether the concentrations within your brewery or your distillery are within safe limits? So please make sure, if you don't already do it, you go out, you buy your CO2 alarms, you install them properly, you train staff on what to do if an alarm goes off, and then you can be considered duly diligent. If any sort of sampling that you guys do for CO2 indicates that the exposure will be 50% or greater of the occupational exposure limit, which I know probably means nothing to you guys right now, but that's fine, you'll need to make sure that you have an exposure control plan in place. For the craft breweries and distilleries, I can't imagine that would ever be the case. I can't imagine you would ever have exposures greater than 50%. But in the event that you do identify that, you do need to ensure that you have an exposure control plan in place as well. As with anything from your safety program, training of staff is key. And please just make a note that anytime you do provide training to staff on anything health and safety related, you want to make sure that you've got a training sign-off or a document to prove that that training has taken place. If you don't have a document, you can't prove that it's happened, and in health and safety we like to say if it's not written down, it didn't happen. And that's all part of your due diligence package. So you want to make sure that for CO2, staff understand the hazards of it they understand where they may be exposed to it, they understand what to do if they identify an issue with it, what to do if somebody's been overcome by CO2, and so on. And another important component of your program related to CO2 is maintenance and inspection. So if you've got a proper preventative maintenance program in place, you've got an inspection program in place, that's going to go a really, really long way at avoiding and preventing possible leaks with cylinders, tanks, and pipes, and so on. So if you don't already have a maintenance or a preventative maintenance or inspection program in place, that's another thing that I strongly encourage you guys to do and go back and make sure that you've implemented that for your breweries. And ventilation is obviously key for safely working around CO2. And something to consider as well is if you guys are growing your brewery or your distillery, you're adding more equipment and more tanks and so on, you'll also want to ensure that you are increasing the ventilation as well. And then, like I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you've got emergency procedures in place. So just a side note, separate from CO2, anybody in here, you should have a general emergency response plan or an emergency response manual where you've got provisions for what to do in the event of fire, things like an earthquake, maybe workplace violence, an explosion, and so on. And as part of those procedures, you'll want to make sure that you've included CO2 as well. Oops. Okay, so that was it for CO2. And then the final hazard that I want to go over with you guys, generally speaking, is moving kegs. So manually moving kegs is the #1 cause of injuries in breweries and distilleries. It's something that's done every single day. It's a run-of-the-mill, a normal task. However, it is considered quite high risk because it is the #1 cause of injuries and incidents. It can affect your claims costs. You can be paying more out of pocket if you don't have proper system in place to control it. So as we all know, kegs are heavy and they can be extremely awkward and difficult to move. A full 50-liter keg will weigh approximately 63 kgs or 140 pounds. So you can imagine if you've got staff moving multiple kegs throughout their shift, repeatedly throughout their employment with you, that definitely increases their risk of injury. The main risk of moving kegs are musculoskeletal injuries, or MSIs, and those will affect things like your muscles and your tendons and your ligaments, and they can affect bodies of your area such as your back, your wrist, your arms, your neck. It can even affect your legs if you're moving them in a really awkward way. But MSIs are the biggest risk and also the biggest injury that happens at breweries. So if we go back to that hierarchy of controls, the very best option to control this risk is to eliminate it. Obviously, you guys can't eliminate the use of kegs. It's the nature of the business. You can't just completely get rid of them altogether, and that's fine. But what you can do is you can utilize smaller kegs when necessary, but I think everybody's already doing that to begin with. Another option is to look at an engineering control, which could include mechanical aids, so using things like dollies and keg lifts. And what that will do is that will completely eliminate the need for people to manually lift heavy kegs. An administrative control that everybody should have in place is training. So you might think, oh, it's common sense, everybody knows how to properly lift a keg, they'll figure it out, it's fine. But you do have a responsibility to ensure that staff have received proper training on manual handling and proper lifting technique. So what that training should look like is reminding staff about the need to bend with their legs, not with their back, making sure they're holding the load close to their body, making sure that they're not awkwardly twisting as they're carrying a heavy keg, and so on. And as with any other training, you'll want to make sure that that training is documented with a sign-off. You'll also want to develop safe work procedures. So you might notice a trend throughout this presentation that a lot of the hazards will require written safe work procedures. Staff will also have the option to roll, push, or slide kegs as needed. It depends on the layout, where they need to move things, but that is another option to safely move kegs. Another key to the effective control of moving kegs is a job rotation. So instead of having one employee moving kegs throughout the entire shift, what you can do is you can alternate the tasks throughout the shift so that people get a bit of a break in between moving kegs. Another really important part to any sort of manual handling is planning your route. And this is something that bothers me. I see it all the time in my career, is that people will not pre-plan their route when they're going to lift something heavy. It's so simple and it goes so far at preventing musculoskeletal injuries, which again is the #1 cause of injuries in breweries. So making sure that you're talking to people and saying, listen, I'm going to be moving a bunch of kegs. Can you please be aware of me, making sure that you're out of the way when I'm coming through, making sure that any hoses and tools are moved out of the way as best as possible, making sure that any doorways are pre-opened before you pull up, so that you don't have to do that when you're carrying the heavy keg. And then the final thing about moving kegs is that PPE, which is the very bottom of the hierarchy of controls, there's not too many options for it. You might want to utilize some sort of gloves, maybe to get a better grip on the kegs, but things like back braces and back belts are not recommended. A lot of people think that that'll go a really far way at controlling it and making sure that people's backs are properly supported, but there's actually been no scientific evidence to support that. There's actually been scientific evidence to support the opposite of that. So there's this great resource, and please write it down if you guys have a pen, and it's the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, or CCOHS, and it's got a lot of excellent information on back supports and anything else that's health and safety related as well. Okay, so we've gone over a lot of information today, and I'll just take the next couple of slides to summarize it, and then that's going to be it for me. So we've gone over a lot of hazards. The very first one that we went over was confined space. We touched on CO2 and moving kegs. I told you guys that you can find more information on confined space in Part 9 of the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. And because the regulations are very performance-based and not very prescriptive, WorkSafe BC has also developed Part 9 guidelines on confined space as well. Anytime you're considering controls to any sort of hazards within your workplace, you want to consider the hierarchy of controls. So again, that's elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. You want to make sure that any components of your program are developed by a qualified person. Training is the key to successful implementation of any components of your program. And as I keep saying, you want to make sure that those training records are retained. And then you want to make sure that you have an annual review of your program as well. And then just to quickly summarize the 3 hazards that we reviewed and what you guys can do to ensure compliance. So for confined space, the very first thing you need to do is acknowledge the fact that it is a major risk. You want to walk around your brewery or your distillery and identify all of the confined spaces. You want to ensure that you're conducting your risk assessments on the confined space and ensuring that those are documented. You'll need to develop written safe work procedures, making sure that you've got a permitting system in place, and ensuring that you have training and supervision for anybody who will be required to enter the confined space. We went over CO2 very briefly, and as we know, it's an inhalation hazard. Exposure to high concentrations of CO2 can take place while you're purging tanks, or there might be leaks from pipe cylinders or tanks. You may require an exposure control plan if testing has proven that if you have levels greater than 50% of the exposure limit, and you'll want to make sure that you have a CO2 alarm in place. And then the final thing that we went over today was moving kegs. So as I mentioned, moving kegs is the #1 cause of injuries in the industry, so it is something that does need to be taken quite seriously. They're heavy and very awkward to move. The main risk of moving kegs are musculoskeletal injuries. You want to look into options for controlling these risks by utilizing mechanical aids. And you want to make sure that manual handling and proper lifting technique is observed by your staff, and making sure that staff have received the appropriate training. And of course, you'll want to develop written safe work procedures. And that is it for the presentation today. We don't have time for questions, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to find me afterwards, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much, you guys.